So to create a character rig, we're going to need a character model and a character skeleton. And then we will attach that model to the skeleton and use the skeleton to move around portions of the model. So the way you go about creating a skeleton is through an armature. So we can hit Shift A, armature, and you can add a single bone here. And if I tab into edit mode, I can then begin adding more bones. Up here, you'll see how I have the bone info. So if I was to grab this bone, I could go ahead and press E to extrude and Z, and that would create another bone there. Now, if I tab into pose mode here, I can go ahead and rotate that bone, and you see how that top bone is attached because that is parented to this bone. If I tab into edit mode here, I can hit Alt P to clear the parent, and I can choose to clear the parent of the bone or disconnect the bone. So if I disconnect the bone, I can move that bone away, switch back into pose mode, and it's disconnected off on its own, but it's still attached, but I can grab it and move it around. If I tab back in the edit mode and clear parent completely and go back into pose mode, you see that those bones no longer attach one another. And that's the basics of how these bones will be attached to one another. It can get more complicated than that, but that's all you need to know at the moment. Now, one thing to consider too is the axes of the bone. So here you can see that in local mode, when I have this bone and the rotation gizmo selected, I can rotate it on the Y and the Z and the X. Let's go ahead and reset that by pressing Alt R. Now, if I tab into edit mode here, we have this thing called bone roll. And you can see here that it's set to 0, but if I go ahead and rotate this and turn on my axes for visibility, you'll see that each one of these bones has their own axis, and that bone roll is rotating that. Now, if I tab back into pose mode, you can see that the axes here are different than the ones here because the bone has rolled. Now, when you're rigging certain elements of characters, for example, say if you have strands of hair on a character, you may want to roll these bones to kind of match the direction that you planned to rotate those pieces of the character. Now, we're not going to be doing anything complicated with the bone roll in this class, so try not to get too overwhelmed by it if you don't quite understand it yet, but this is just a basic intro into how it works. Now, here is a rig skeleton example with no character model attached. And this is how things can get a lot more complicated, where when I tap into pose mode here, if I grab one of these feet here and I move this in the side view, you can see how it's automatically rotating all of these bones to follow. And that's something called an IK system, which we'll talk about a bit more later. But this is what's called a bone constraint. So if I come here to the bone constraint tab with that bone selected, you can see some of the constraints I have attached, in this case, a copy scale. So you can add bone constraints and create pretty complex rigs. We'll be doing a simple bone constraint on our character rig, which we'll talk more about later. It's also worth noting that you may notice none of these are actual bones. If I tab into edit mode here, you'll see that these are all bones. This is the actual skeleton in edit view. When we tab out into pose mode, you can see that we have all these what are called custom controls. These don't serve any purpose besides just being visually easier to use for animators and making things stand out a bit more when you have complex rigs like this. We'll go through how to create your own custom controls later in this class as well. So we know that we need a model and that we need a rig to create a character rig, but how do we go about telling the character rig which portions of the model to move? So you know that if we grab, for example, this hip here, it's only going to move the bones and portions of the body associated with the hip. Well, it's through a technique called weight painting. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. If I switch over here to object view, I'm going to go into weight painting mode on the arms. And you'll notice here that over in the vertex group tab, all the bones in the rig are listed in the vertex group. And that's because when we parent our model to the rig, it is going to create a vertex group for every bone. And then we can go through in these vertex groups and assign painted weights to each one of them to determine what portions of the model that bone will move. So here you can see that we have the deformation forearm bone selected on the left side of our character, and that everything red is 100% under that bone's control. And then as it tapers off to blue, it goes out to 0% of control. And if I go ahead and grab the next bone in that, you can see how those begin to kind of overlap and share in between. To make this even a bit easier to understand, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the thumb bones here, and then we can switch back out into pose mode, grab that bone, and you can see how that kind of corresponds to the weight paint and is only affecting the bones associated with that. There are a couple different ways to assign weights in Blender. One way is through the weight painting tool, which if you have the bone selected and you're in the weight painting mode, you can actually go ahead and just begin painting in that. And there are various tools up here, such as blurring, and we'll use some of these later. You also have the option of tabbing into edit mode and selecting points and then going ahead and assigning them a weight on a 1 to 0 scale. So if I go ahead and grab all of these and go ahead and assign 1 and then switch back to weight point mode, you can see how now this bone is controlling everything. Now, one thing worth noting is that if two bones are controlling the same area, it may cause some issues. So as we just went ahead and assigned all these to this thumb bone, if I come out here and grab this bone, you can see now that when I grab this bone, it is causing a whole host of issues as it is now fighting the other bones for the same area of the model. Now, Blender has a normalize feature. If you come up here to weights, normalize all, what it will do is try and normalize all the bones so that no two bones are fighting too much over same portions of the model. And this will fix some of kind of the simpler issues, but as you're painting in weight paints, this is something you want to be mindful of. Now, again, our character rig is going to be simple, so this shouldn't be too much of an issue for us. So that's how we go about attaching the model to our armature. As I said, this may seem a bit overwhelming at this moment, but with our character, we'll be doing a much more simple example, and I promise you'll understand by the end of the class. Now, shape keys are a cool feature that allows you to take a model and then edit that version of the model and create a new version, and then you can use this slider here to change in between the two versions. Now, this can be helpful on character rigs using something called corrective shape keys. So if I move our character leg up here, it's likely that not all this geometry would deform as we want it to. So if you look over here in the shape key menu, you can see that by moving this leg up, a lot of these values have changed. And that's because these are purple, indicating that they have drivers on them, meaning that the position of the bone can drive the value of this. We'll be looking at how to do this later in the course with a blinking rig for our owl character, so you should hopefully understand that a bit more by the end. But if I go ahead and start deleting these shape keys, pay attention up here, you will see how it begins changing the shape and how that deformation doesn't necessarily look realistic with the hip kind of dipping in. So those corrective shape keys can be used across the rig to allow you to do more extreme motions and get a natural deformation.